Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is entitled Preschool Inclusive Practices, and our presenter for today's webinar is Michelle Ogorek. Michelle has been working in the field of early childhood for over 25 years as a provider, a mentor, a diagnostician, and a program support teacher, and is currently working as the Wisconsin statewide early childhood coordinator. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to Michelle Ogorek. Michelle?
Yes. Well, welcome everybody. I'm excited to be here. I do thank you for taking time in the middle of your day, maybe spending lunch with me. Bonnie, I also want to thank you for inviting me. I just want to introduce myself a little bit more when what my current role is as early childhood coordinator for Wisconsin. In this role, I have the luxury and the honor of working with inclusive services through children 3 through 5. So inclusion is near and dear to my heart, and I actually have the ability now that it's actually my full-time job. So I'm here for support in any way. I'm also going to provide you with a few additional supports that you can have looking at inclusive services, especially for preschool children. Okay, so what I'd like to do today is that when you walk away, I would like everyone to clearly know what preschool inclusion is. I'd like you to think about, be able to articulate the benefits of preschool inclusion, why we want and promote preschool inclusion, and then what it actually looks like in practice. So those are the goals for today. Hopefully we will meet all those and you will walk out of here as preschool inclusion experts. First, I want to take a look at the history of inclusion. I want to take a look back in time to see where we were, to see how far we've come, but most importantly, to see where we need to go. So we're going to take a historical walk on the evolution of inclusion. So you will see in the next following slides, you're going to see some visual displays that display the different points in time and history with relation to inclusion. I'm actually going to have you do a little thinking, and I'm going to have you try to guess which visual representation matches which word. So let's take a quick historical walk. So first, what we have here on our inclusion journey is I want to explain, you're going to see a series of 4 different graphics like this. The first thing that you need to know are the green dots. The green dots represent children without disabilities. I typically don't like to say I'm representing all children without disabilities, that they all look the same, but for this purpose in this visual display, just go with me on this one. So the green dots are children without disabilities, and the variety of the colors outside of the circle are children with disabilities. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at the 4 words that are on the bottom right hand of your screen, and you see inclusion, exclusion, segregation, and integration. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think of this visual graphic, which of those 4 words seem to represent this? I'll give you a second. Again, green dots are children without disabilities, and colored dots are children with disabilities. So hopefully you all have the word in your mind right now. These are graphics from Shelley Moore, who is an inclusion specialist, and I just think they do a really nice way of representing our history. The first one is exclusion. So this one really is a graphic of exclusion. And we actually did have this at one time. Of course, no one on the call is old enough to remember this, but back in the 50s and 60s, our youngest students were not allowed to be included in any way. And many times they didn't even have access to education. So also at times, parents were many times even told by doctors that they may have to think about institutionalization of their young child. So thank goodness we're no longer here. And also I have to say thanks to disability advocates, and most of all, thanks to you as parents. You actually made the evolution of inclusion start. So this was exclusion, and this happened in the 50s and 60s. Okay. So now I want you to take a look at this. one and see which of the 4 words best represents this. Again, green dots are children without disabilities, and colored dots are children with disabilities. Okay, hopefully everybody picked segregation. We're traveling into the 1970s or 80s. And this is when children had access to education and school buildings. But many times they were out in their own wing, or they were in the basement. They definitely were not part of the school. Many times preschool children were in their own segregated classrooms. What happened in the 70s and 80s, in 1975, I believe, there was a public law, 94-142, and that was really monumental legislation that started children to be able to have free appropriate education and the start of IDEA. And I'll talk about those in a couple words. So at this point, parents were still asking questions. Is this the best that we can do for our children with disabilities? So as with evolution, we moved on. Take a look at this one. This one's integration. So this is when our preschoolers had access to the general education environment, but many times it kind of looked like a mini special ed environment right inside that general ed classroom. These were times when you might think of children that they had access to their peers, but they may have had access only during lunch, gym, or art. Also, many times, this is when students were sitting at the back of the room that were doing something totally different. They really were not truly and fully accessing, engaging, or participating in that general ed environment. I'd like to say that we have moved on, and in some programs we have, but we still do have a lot of programs and a lot of services to early childhood in this type of model, where we have access to our typically developing peers, but we really aren't truly fully part of that program and fully access and engaging. This is where we want to go. This is inclusion. This is what true inclusion would look like. Our ultimate goal, whenever possible, for preschoolers with disabilities is they are accessing, participating with their typically developing peers, and they have whatever supports they need to be successful in their environment. That's inclusion. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and we're always going to be only focusing on the preschool inclusion. This graphic is also representative of 3 through 21 in the whole education realm, but from now on, everything I talk about is going to be very directed towards preschool. So we still have a long way to go. Sometime maybe we're going to get to inclusion 2.0, and in my vision, that would be when every child gets exactly what they need. We don't need to worry about labels. Differences are kind of viewed as contributions. We focus on strengths rather than deficits. So I bet some parents out there like you and some disability advocates, someday we might move to inclusion 2.0. So I want to talk about a couple words that I'm going to use throughout the webinar, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. So let's quickly review some language. The first one is free appropriate public education. Remember when I said we had that landmark legislation? In that legislation, we set the foundation for children with disabilities receiving services. We talked about free appropriate public education. And what that is, that just means any child 3 through 21 with a disability, they have the right to free appropriate public education. I think as a society, we have done really good with the free and the public part of this this phrase, but we really haven't addressed the appropriate as much as we need to. That seems to be the part that's difficult. I want you to think about this. Many times when we're talking about inclusion, you know, when we think about the word appropriate, this would be putting kids in a classroom with typically developing peers, and they have all the support they need. Many times we do see children in a regular education environment and they don't have all the supports they need. So we always want to be working for appropriate. What's appropriate for that kiddo? The next one is IDEA, and IDEA are the rules and the regulations that govern our world of special education and specialized services. Some examples that's included in the IDEA legislation, IEPs, specialized services that are unique to your individual child, parent involvement, and then some of the safeguards, and then something called least restrictive environment. So I want to talk a little bit about least restrictive environment because that is an extremely important topic when we are going to be talking about inclusive services. So there's 3 really important words that you need to know when it comes to least restrictive environment. The definition is to the maximum extent appropriate. Children with disabilities will be educated with their non-disabled peers. The 3 important words here are the maximum extent appropriate. And that means we look at every child individually, we look at their needs, and that's how we determine what the least restrictive environment is for that child. The least restrictive environment is different for every single child. And when you have IEP meetings, you do go through those type of things. Another thing that I want to say is when we talk about least restrictive environment, sometimes you hear a school district or a program will say, next year we are going to be 100%, all children are going to be 100% fully included. I want you to think about that. When we determine what the least restrictive environment is, we would never say a phrase like that because it's based on the individual unique needs of each child, and the IEP teams are the determine what least restrictive environment is for that particular child. And I do want you to remember, as a parent, you are definitely part of that IEP team. Okay, so sometimes we hear the word LRE, least restrictive environment, and we hear the word inclusion, and we think that those 2 words are interchangeable. They are not, okay? Inclusion is not even mentioned in IDEA. The terms are not interchangeable. When I talk today about least restrictive environment, it's very specific to IDEA and IEPs and legal requirements. We need to remember that least restrictive environment is in part of IDEA. LRE, least restrictive environment, is a right. It's not doing a favor for a child. It's not a privilege. It is the law. So this is when we talk about IEPs and that, we definitely talk about least restrictive environment. Many times when we talk about inclusion, it's more of a belief that all students, regardless of any type of labels or needs, should be members of that general ed community. So it's a bit more philosophical. So today when I talk about least restrictive environment, we're going to be focusing on more of the legal aspect. And when I talk about inclusion, it's more of that bigger umbrella. And then finally, IEPs. So I think everybody is probably familiar with IEPs. One quick note, I think everybody knows this by now. It refers to individualized education programs, not plans. The IEP is really, I want you to think of it more than just that written legal document or that accountability tool. I want you to think about it like a map. It's really what lays out the program of special education for a particular child. It talks about the instruction, the supports, and the services that that child will need in order to make progress and thrive in school. Many of you, if you just recently are coming from birth to 3, you may have heard of an IFSP, which is really an individual service, family services plan. Typically, when you are in birth to 3, you have an IFSP, and when you move to the world of Part B education or education in the school districts from 3 through 21, we talk about an IEP. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a brain break here, and I'm going to have you put on your thinking caps. I want you to think to yourself, if this statement is true or false. School districts are required to have my child be included 100% of the time. So is that true or false? School districts are required to have my child included 100% of the time. Hopefully you mentioned false, because remember, when we're thinking about least restrictive environment and the amount of time that a child will be involved in the gen ed environment or the regular education environment, it is truly unique to each child, and their services should be based on their needs. And IEP teams are the ones that make those decisions. Okay, so we got the legal part back. We have the evolution of inclusion. If anybody has any questions on those, you can put those in the question box, and then Bonnie will read them to me. I'm going to keep moving forward, but Bonnie, definitely jump in if a question comes up. Okay, so why all of a sudden is preschool inclusion coming to the forefront? In 2015, the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Ed worked together to create a statement that is a joint policy that talks about what the benefits of preschool inclusion are, what districts should be doing with relation to preschool inclusion, and then what some recommendations states and local districts can do. It's a really great document. I have the address here on the slide if you want to take a look at it. But what it really did is it just provided guidance and recommendations. And we in Wisconsin took this document very seriously. And that has been the foundational piece of all of our promotion of inclusive services. It's also been the foundational piece of all of the work that we've been doing. Okay, what I'd like you to do again, take a couple minutes, and I want you to think about in your mind, why should we have inclusive services? Why are we talking about inclusive preschool services? What are the benefits to my child? What are the benefits to other children? What are the benefits to our family? So I'll give you a second to think about that. Hopefully you can come up with one or two ideas. Okay, let's talk about some of these benefits. So first of all, when we talk, there are many more benefits than the benefits that I have on the slide. I just wanted you to see some of the big ones and the ones I really wanted to focus on. So some of the benefits of preschool inclusive services is so that children will learn the skills that they need in the places that they're actually going to use them. We want to make sure that we're not teaching these isolated, discrete skills in these artificial environments. Wherever kids need the skills, that's where we should be teaching them to use them. We want to make sure that children don't miss opportunities to practice those skills. I want to give you an example of if I was learning how to golf, okay? If I took lessons once a week, I had the instructor and we worked on my swing and all the components of golf. Thinking about after a year of working with that individual, would I really have mastered the skill of golf? Would I have mastered all of the aspects of being able now to go to a golf course and be able to actually go through all the holes? Would I be able to know how to use the tools associated with a golf course? Would I be able to interact with people appropriately on a golf course? This is what we think about. We want to make sure that kids have time to practice the skills we're working on them, but we want to make sure that they're learning them in those environments where they're actually using those skills. We always talk about young skill development, and we don't just teach a skill once and expect it to be mastered. We have to be able to have children have opportunities to practice those skills, which they can do in that regular education environment. And once they can generalize those skills to other areas, we've typically said they've mastered that skill. So it's really important to have a lot of opportunities to practice, and it's really important to learn the skills in the environment when we're actually going to use them. Another benefit is so that children don't miss out on classroom activities. I want to give you an example here. Let's say I have a child that has speech therapy, and maybe the speech pathologist takes the child out of the K-4 classroom, and she does her therapy in her particular therapy room. And then the child has to transition in and out, back and again. When the child is getting that speech therapy, we don't want to make sure that they're missing anything, nor do we want to make sure that kiddos that have difficulty with transitions, sometimes by the time they go in and out for OT or PT or speech or any type of itinerant services, those are the kiddos that actually have difficulty with transitions, and we're making them transition the most. So we really want to keep that in mind. That's a definite benefit of preschool inclusion. Another benefit is so that teachers can see what the therapists are actually doing to support the children and whatever strategies or techniques they're using. And then we can expand on those skills as early childhood teachers and also as parents. So example of this is when I was a teacher in an early childhood classroom, and I was in a self-contained early childhood classroom. I have to tell you, this was more than 30 years ago. I had a speech pathologist that actually came into my early childhood classroom. So they were not coming into a regular ed environment, but they were coming into my classroom that was totally comprised of children with disabilities. And when I saw some of the strategies and the techniques that that therapist did, what that allowed me to do is when some of my students received speech therapy 30 minutes a week or maybe an hour a week. But when that speech pathologist left, by being able to see how she utilized different strategies, what particular skills she was working on, it allowed me to be able to give children opportunities to practice again and again on those skills when they weren't receiving speech therapy. Another benefit, so that teachers and therapists can really focus on the skills that need to be addressed immediately and skills that are useful for children. So a couple things with relation to this. If something happens in the moment, that is the best time to teach. That is the best time to address the skill development at that point. So we really want to make sure that therapists and teachers can collaborate and work together in that real time. We also want to make sure that the skills that we're working on, if we see what's happening with typically developing kids in that general ed environment, we want to make sure that the skills that we focus on are skills that are going to be useful to be utilized in that environment. We want to make sure that our children that have an IEP, that really when we're working on those goals, they are goals that are really high leverage skills. Those are goals and skills that are going to make the most impact for this particular child. We just want to make sure that we're not trying to teach isolated, discrete skills. And then finally, at the end, it's just because it's the right thing to do. So there's many more benefits as to why inclusive preschool services benefit children, families, and the adults that support them. I just wanted to kind of touch, this is the tip of the iceberg. I actually will send Bonnie a document that I'll ask her to post with this that will talk about all of the benefits, the majority of the benefits. And then one final benefit that I think sometimes we breeze over is really looking at let's not forget friendship. That is an extremely important part, the social development of our children. Having access to a wide variety of children is monumentally important. And also really to truly have friends. We all want to belong. We all want to be included and we all want to belong. So let's talk a little bit about what high quality preschool inclusion is and then what it's not. Okay, so when we talk about high quality preschool inclusion, and I want to make sure you notice that I said high quality. When I talk about inclusive services, these things need to be in place in order to have the service be high quality. We don't just want to say, oh, we're going to do inclusion, or we're even going to be providing the least restrictive environment, but we're just going to put the child in that environment and not give them the appropriate supports they need. So I want to make sure that whenever I say inclusion, we always are talking about high quality. So high quality preschool inclusion is when the student is a valued member of the classroom and part of the school community. We want to make sure that if I have a child with a disability in a K-4 classroom, we want to make sure that they absolutely feel welcomed and they feel to be a valued member of that classroom. Sorry, my clicker doesn't seem to be moving here. Hold on. Okay, we want to make sure that preschoolers with disabilities are meaningfully engaged and participating with peers. The key word here is meaningful. We want to make sure that students are engaging in whatever the activity is to the best of their ability. If they need any type of adaptations, accommodations, or modifications to be more meaningfully engaged, that those are in place. And then finally, we want to make sure that it's not just a place or a geography. We want to make sure that everybody has attitudes and beliefs and kind of a culture of inclusive services. Now let's talk about what high quality preschool inclusion is not. So saying that every child will always be fully included all of the time. We've touched on that really it needs to be based on the amount of services and supports and where the services take place. The environment needs to be based on the unique needs of that child, and the IEP team does make that decision. We want to make sure that preschool inclusion is not waiting to see when students are expected to be ready for regular ed. Children don't need to be ready for regular education or have access to typically developing peers. What we need to do is first thing we need to ask is, where is that child and can we provide adequate support? So if I have a child in a K-4 classroom, the first question I ask is, where is that child and can we provide adequate supports for that child to grow and develop and meet successfully their IEP goals? So children don't have to be ready for regular ed. We as teachers need to be able to set up an environment that is appropriate for them. Another thing that preschool inclusion is not, it's not when only students with the mildest delays are included, and children that have very significant delays are in segregated or separate special education classrooms. When we talk about inclusive services, I think many times people equate that the amount of inclusive services is based on the skill level or the need of the child. What I'm going to say is there is a great deal of research that shows students with significant needs perform wonderfully, and they grow and develop and master skills in that regular ed environment. So it doesn't necessarily matter particularly what the skill level is. It matters when the IEP team meets and they talk about where this child is and what they particularly want to work on, and if it is able to be done in the regular ed environment, depending on whatever need they have, then we'll provide those services and we'll talk about that least restrictive environment, and the IEP team will make those decisions. Okay, another brain break, another put on your thinking hats. So true or false? Inclusion looks the same for every single child. Hopefully everybody said false, because inclusion is unique and individual to that each particular child. And then another final thing is making sure that we place children. So when children are in the regular ed environment, that we make sure that we have provided the appropriate supports for them. These are three really important words that, especially in preschool, when we talk about inclusive services, we talk about access, participation, and supports. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to think of these three words, and I'd like you to think about what it would look like in action, or what you might see in your child's program, or if you're an educator, what you might see in your particular program. So if your child was accessing in Utopia, what would that look like? If your child was participating, what would that look like? And if your child had supports, what supports might those be? Okay, so let's go through these. Inclusion in early childhood programs. This is the definition from the Department of Health and Human Service and the Department of Ed, their joint definition of inclusive services. Let's take a look at each of these individually. So it's including children with disabilities in the general ed early childhood programs together with their peers without disabilities. That is what we mean by access. This is when we are looking at children having access. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to make your view of access kind of under a larger umbrella. You know, we are typically talking about access to peers right here, but I also want you to think about access to the environment, access to materials in that environment, access to that general ed curriculum, and access to any learning opportunities or age-appropriate activities that might be taking place. The next part of the definition is holding high expectations and intentionally promoting participation in all learning and social activities facilitated by individual accommodations. This is when we're talking about participation, and we're talking about meaningful participation. We want to make sure that we are promoting the feeling of belonging. We want to make sure that our children are engaged. We want to make sure that they are meaningfully involved, that they have the supports that they need, which leads us to the final component of the definition. Using evidence-based services and supports to foster their development, friendship with peers, and sense of belonging. When we think about supports, it's those things that we put in place to help the children learn and grow, to be more engaged, to be able to have more participation and align with their IEP goals. Some supports that you might see, sometimes you might see related services. You might see specially designed instruction. We will see specially designed instruction. Also the collaboration and partnerships between staff and you as an educator, you as a parent. So those are all things that will play a part. So this is the definition of all the components. And as you can see, the 3 key words that would be words that I would want you to remember are access, participation, and support. And I'm actually going to say meaningful participation and appropriate supports, all the supports the child needs. You know, one thing as a parent, you are the expert on the needs of your child. Make sure you share what those needs are. Make sure you share the strengths. Make sure you have a voice. And if needed, make sure you advocate if necessary. So what I want to do here is I want to talk about a few areas. It's the words that are in red. I'd like to talk about a few areas where sometimes parents or educators encounter some bumps in the road. These are a few areas where least restrictive environment and inclusive services need to be thought of more at a particular point, and you as a parent might want to have a particular voice in these different areas. So let's talk about assessment first. So here, one bump in the road that usually happens during initial eligibility. I want you to think about that you make your voice known early in that process, because what you're really doing is you're setting the foundation for your relationship with the district, and you're also setting the foundation of what your wishes might be. So something to think about as you progress through any evaluation, that you always make it known that you really would like some discussion about inclusive services. And also, if you use the word least restrictive environment, and we'll talk about how that becomes more important in the IEP process, those discussions will actually come up. Let's talk a little bit about placement. In early childhood, we talk about something called preschool options. And when we talk about preschool options, what we are doing is we are deciding the many places that young children that are preschoolers can be served. Because many times when we have 3-year-olds, they're not in school. So I just want everyone definitely to know that when you have a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old that's going through the evaluation process, and you get to the point to talk about where services will be held, I just want you to know, under preschool options, many different places services can take place. They can take place in your home. They can take place in your child's childcare if they're going to childcare. If your child's in a preschool, they could take places at that preschool. Or some services could take place right in the school district's building. So there's a wide array of placements, and that's pretty unique to preschool because typically many of our kids are not in school when they have the initial evaluation. And we always ask the question, because this is what we do with least restrictive environment, we ask, where is my child? And can services be provided for them there to make progress and grow and develop and make progress on their IEP goals? So making sure that is always a discussion, especially at the end of the IEP meeting when you're starting to talk about where some of those services might be provided. Just be aware that all of those options are all viable options that absolutely can be discussed at an IEP meeting. Districts are required to have a continuum of services. They can't have every single child, preschooler with a disability, receive the exact same thing. Again, it's based on their unique needs, and it's based on what that IEP decides. So I'll just keep that in the back of your mind. A little bit about IEP meetings. This is where the start many times of where LRE discussions take place. I want you to think about during that IEP meeting, when everyone is starting to talk about the goals, and then they're talking about the specially designed instruction and the related services and supplementary aids and services. And then they talk about where can those be provided. Can they be provided in the regular education environment or provided in a special education environment? When those discussions take place, you need to be an advocate for your child. You need to take an active role. You need to ask questions, and think about how you may ask those questions to bring up some of those discussions as to where services might take place. And then final services. Here, this is when we're talking about working with the special ed teacher, working with the related service providers, working with the general ed. And things to think about there is your child, if your child is in a special ed environment or a regular ed environment, making sure that we're always asking, is my child making progress? And if they aren't, how we might explore why they are not making the progress that we think they should. Another thing to make sure with relation to services, making sure that you clearly are aware in the IEP as to what services, and also remember that, you know, sometimes we don't think about that in an IEP. If we're providing some specially designed instruction, some of that specially designed instruction can take place in the regular ed environment, but some of it can take place in the special ed environment. It doesn't have to be an all or none situation. It's based on each unique need of the child and what type of specially designed instruction they need, and then the team decides where those particular services are going to be provided. And then one quick little tidbit before I talk about partnership, I just wanted you to know that districts do have a requirement to report to DPI the number of students that attend a regular early childhood program and they receive the majority of their specially designed instruction, of their related services in that program, meaning that where a teacher or a therapist comes and provides the services in that gen ed environment. So school districts are aware that this is something that we're striving for. We have targets in the state, and that we are striving to have more and more children serviced in inclusive environments, and environments where they are, example as a K-4 classroom, instead of always removing children. We know children learn best with other children, and we know we have many benefits why inclusive services are significantly important. Here, what we have is the final one is partnership. And when I talk about partnership, I'm talking about it on several different levels. We need to make sure that the partnership, if we want to truly have high quality inclusive services, there has to be a partnership between anyone that is providing any specialized services and the general education teacher. And I'm going to go one step further. You need to be involved in that process too. The partnership needs to be that if we know if everybody's working towards the same goal, and if we're all in this together, it definitely is going to ensure more success for our students. So making sure that as a parent, you have a voice, you should have a voice throughout all of these different steps and processes. And at times, you know, if needed, you may have to advocate certain things for your child. One thing I just wanted to put out on the thing as a former early childhood teacher, and as when I had students in my classroom, when I had strong relationships with the families, and I worked closely with the families, and I had strong relationships with all the individuals that were involved in the education of that child, when we worked together towards a common goal, we were definitely stronger, and the development and the growth of children soared. So making sure that we always are thinking about that as the forefront. I'm not going to show you the video right now because it's a little bit longer video, but this is a video that Jenny Bibler, who is a DPI educational consultant, worked on to really show DPI's commitment and vision towards high quality preschool inclusion. I'm going to tell you, it is looking at districts near the Madison and the Midland and Sun Prairie area. And what it is it talks about, from the parent's perspective, positive aspects of inclusive services. And I promise it might even be a tearjerker, so you might need to have a piece of Kleenex with this. So I am open to anybody that has any questions, anything relating to early childhood inclusive services, and I'll even go a step further, anything related to early childhood special ed. So if you have a question, please put it in the question box, and Bonnie will read those, and we'll see if we can get a little discussion going.
So I do have a question for you, Michelle, and that's lots of times people have said that their meetings when they transition from early childhood to their IEPs and early childhood IEPs is not an easy task. Do you have suggestions for parents going through those processes?
Okay, so it is a very big transition, and I think we have to make sure that we're aware of each of the programs are coming about with a different focus. When we are in birth to 3, and I think that this is what makes it such a difficult process. The IFSP focuses on the families and educating and supporting the families to be able to support their child. When we move into the school districts, we're really talking about an IEP, an individualized program for your particular child. Not that we should be forgetting about families, but I do think that is many times an issue. Some suggestions I have, definitely if your child was in birth to 3, you were assigned a service coordinator. That is a fabulous person to help bring to the IEP meeting and to help share information with those IEP teams. Because the birth to 3 may have had your child for 2 years. I mean, they know the child in and out. You know the child better than anybody else. So making sure that all that information transfers to the school district, and then making sure that at that IEP meeting, sometimes the IEP meeting can be a very difficult thing, the first IEP meeting with the school district. In my previous job for many years, I just did diagnostics. I ran the IEP meetings for children birth to 3 coming into my school district. And, you know, we try as much as we can, but at those IEP meetings, we are going to have to, we definitely want to celebrate the strengths of the child, but we are going to have to address what some of the areas of need are. And sometimes it's just hard to be able to really think and engage when sometimes you hear things like that. So your service coordinator is a fabulous person that maybe even before the IEP meeting, you talk with the service coordinator. And you make sure of some of your things that you want to make sure get mentioned, and then the two of you can work together. The other thing is, what a great place to set a solid foundation with birth to 3 and the school district is at that transition planning conference. That's a nice place where you get to know the school district, you can ask questions, and it kind of sets the stage for the future. I hope that met your needs.
Yeah, and I think there's a follow-up to that, and that would be, what is the requirement of, where and when those transition meetings should be held?
Okay, those transition meetings are held before the referral is put in. What happens is, I don't know the exact age, I apologize. I believe I'm not going to say the age, I don't want to say the wrong. But what happens is the birth to 3 decides if your child needs to your child may be eligible. Then what they do is you and the school district have that transition planning conference, and the referral happens before or at that transition planning conference. And then what happens is after that transition planning conference, then that starts the evaluation process.
We don't have any other questions at this time. I would just encourage anyone, if you still had a question, to pass that on. And Michelle, do you have any closing thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I do. I have a couple. I want to make sure that everybody's aware that there are a great many resources out there to support you, and not just physical document type things. There's agencies. I know Facets is always willing to provide any support. We also have some parent organizations across the state, and we have program support teachers, which are in each region of the state, that can absolutely provide support to you if you have questions about the process. And then finally, I just want to have this open here. If you have any questions ever as you're going through the process, you are more than welcome to email me, and I can help facilitate some of those, or at least put you in contact with the right people. But just make sure that when you're engaged at all, this is the first experience, 3 to 5-year-olds usually with the school district. Make sure that you clearly make your voice known. Make sure that you set strong foundation for future interactions with the district, and really try to set a strong relationship. Because if you and the district have a strong relationship, when you encounter anything, it will be just so much easier to actually solve or have those discussions. So there's a lot of people out there to support you. You need to just keep asking questions, because you are the advocate for your child. You know what's best for them, and you need to go out and find resources and help that will support that.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. This will then conclude our webinar. We'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 80 scheduled trainings and webinars for the year 2020. And please feel free to check out our website calendar and register for any of those upcoming trainings that you may be interested in. Also, please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after the conclusion of our live webinar today. Again, I would like to thank Michelle for her presentation today. Lots of really good information that we can take home with us. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a good day, everybody, and be well.
Thank you.